Hi guys, it is Friday, May 12th, and we have moved on to Matthew chapter 27 at the height of Matthew's narrative. If you've already read it, you'll notice that this reading is very fitting to be on a Friday. To start, I'll share some of my highlights with a quick summary of the chapter, and we'll walk through our three questions. Number 1, what does this chapter teach us about Jesus? Number 2, what does it teach about people? And number 3, what next step might this be pointing us to today? I'll then read the full chapter aloud and pray at the end. Yesterday, we left off with Jesus facing the Sanhedrin and Peter disowning his Lord 3 times. Today's chapter starts with Judas Iscariot realizing what a terrible choice he made in betraying Jesus as the chief priests and elders planned to make sure Jesus was killed. Judas admits his sin to them, and in verse 4, which I highlighted, they basically say it doesn't matter to them. It's his responsibility. So then he seems to take it upon himself to enact the punishment, and Judas takes his own life. Jesus is taken to Pilate, where he, unlike Judas, lets those around him decide his fate by staying mostly silent through all of this, and certainly not putting up a fight. In fact, I highlighted verse 14, which says, Jesus made no reply, not even to a single charge, to the great amazement of the governor. So Jesus is even defying Pilate's expectations for dealing with the accused. Pilate's wife believes Jesus was innocent because of a dream, but given the customary opportunity to let Jesus go, Pilate still follows the crowd's demands and releases another prisoner instead. The crowd is still not satisfied, though, and they keep shouting for Jesus to be crucified. I highlighted verse 24b because it kind of parallels the words between Judas and the chief priests and elders. Pilate says, "I am innocent of this man's blood. It is your responsibility." We're told of how Jesus was relentlessly mocked, abused, and insulted as he's led to the place of his crucifixion, and even in his last moments hanging there. Another one of my highlights was verse 45 that says, "From noon until 3 in the afternoon, darkness came over all the land." While you could look at this as simply a factual statement, to me this shows how creation itself recognized how grim the situation was, even though most of the people around were oblivious to the truth. Lastly, I highlighted verses 64 and on because it gives a preemptive response to an argument that still lingers today. The chief priests and Pharisees suspected the disciples might steal Jesus' body to claim he rose again, so they had Pilate order for the tomb to be made as secure as possible with a seal and guards. See, they sealed it to try and falsify any of the disciples' claims that Jesus could rise again. But now this record, if counted credible as we believe it is, can act as evidence against such claims that try to falsify the resurrection. Now, let's go through our questions. What do we learn about Jesus? Considering that our previous chapters showed Jesus in complete emotional anguish, sorrow to the point of death, he said. This chapter shows his incredible strength of spirit and flesh to be able to follow through on what he has been dreading this whole time, but trusting that God's will is best. Because he remains mostly silent, once again we don't quite get to see the full picture of how Jesus was feeling in these gospel scenes, but we know this: he faithfully carried out his mission at the ultimate cost. What do we learn about people from this chapter? For one, people don't like taking blame. We avoid being held accountable for serious wrongdoings with all sorts of distortions of the truth, no matter how obvious when looked at plainly. Pilate clearly had a hand in Jesus' fate by not interfering when he knew the crowd was acting on self-interest, but he insisted it was all on them. The priests and elders disassociated from Judas when he admitted that what they all did was wrong. You might say that even in some of the jokes of the soldiers and passers-by, they implied that Jesus was only suffering because God or Elijah wasn't there, not at all because they were choosing to make him suffer. So, what is the next step for us from today's chapter? Because this chapter includes one of the key components of the gospel itself, I'm going to offer a next step you've probably heard many times, and I pray that it won't fall on deaf ears. Repent to God. Take responsibility for your personal part of the sins for which Jesus paid the deathly wage. Thank Him for not fighting against the cruel plans and demands of those against Him in order to carry out the Father's will. And lastly, over the weekend, consider the time that Jesus spent dead in the grave and thank the Lord again and again that you have the hope of the resurrection and that you weren't there in the time when all of Jesus' followers thought the Messiah was dead and gone forever. Monday's chapter will be much more joyful in that account, but for now, for the last time this week, I'm going to read aloud our chapter of the day and then pray for you all at the end. If you've already read this chapter today, consider yourself sent. Otherwise, Matthew chapter 27. Early in the morning, all the chief priests and the elders of the people made their plans how to have Jesus executed. So they bound him, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate the governor. When Judas, who had betrayed him, saw that Jesus was condemned, he was seized with remorse and returned the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders. "I have sinned," he said, "for I have betrayed innocent blood." "What is that to us?" they replied. "That's your responsibility." So Judas threw the money into the temple and left. Then he went away and hanged himself. The chief priests picked up the coins and said, "It is against the law to put this into the treasury, since it is blood money." So they decided to use the money to buy the potter's field as a burial place for foreigners. That is why it has been called the Field of Blood to this day. Then what was spoken by Jeremiah the prophet was fulfilled. They took the 30 pieces of silver, the price set on him by the people of Israel, and they used them to buy the potter's field, as the Lord commanded me. Meanwhile, Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "You have said so," Jesus replied. When he was accused by the chief priests and the elders, he gave no answer. Then Pilate asked him, "Don't you hear the testimony they are bringing against you?" But Jesus made no reply, not even to a single charge, to the great amazement of the governor. Now it was the governor's custom at the festival to release a prisoner chosen by the crowd. At that time, they had a well-known prisoner whose name was Jesus Barabbas. So when the crowd had gathered, Pilate asked them, "Which one do you want me to release to you, Jesus Barabbas, or Jesus who is called the Messiah?" For he knew it was out of self-interest that they had handed Jesus over to him. While Pilate was sitting on the judge's seat, his wife sent him this message: "Don't have anything to do with that innocent man, for I have suffered a great deal today in a dream because of him." But the chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowd to ask for Barabbas and to have Jesus executed. "Which of the two do you want me to release to you?" asked the governor. "Barabbas," they answered. "What shall I do then with Jesus, who is called the Messiah?" Pilate asked. They all answered, "Crucify him." "Why? What crime has he committed?" asked Pilate. But they shouted all the louder, "Crucify him." When Pilate saw that he was getting nowhere, but that instead an uproar was starting, he took water and washed his hands in front of the crowd. "I am innocent of this man's blood," he said. "It is your responsibility." All the people answered, "His blood is on us and on our children." Then he released Barabbas to them, but he had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. Then the governor's soldiers took Jesus into the praetorium and gathered the whole company of soldiers around him. They stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him, and then twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on his head. They put a staff in his right hand. Then they knelt in front of him and mocked him. "Hail, King of the Jews," they said. They spit on him and took the staff and struck him on the head again and again. After they had mocked him, they took off the robe and put his own clothes on him. Then they led him away to crucify him. As they were going out, they met a man from Cyrene named Simon, and they forced him to carry the cross. They came to a place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. There they offered Jesus wine to drink, mixed with gall, but after tasting it, he refused to drink it. When they had crucified him, they divided up his clothes by casting lots, and sitting down, they kept watch over him there. Above his head they placed the written charge against him: "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." 2 rebels were crucified with him, one on his right and one on his left. Those who passed by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, "You who are going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself. Come down from the cross if you are the Son of God." In the same way, the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the elders mocked him. "He saved others," they said, "but he can't save himself. He's the King of Israel. Let him come down now from the cross, and we will believe in him. He trusts in God. Let God rescue him now, if he wants him. For he said, 'I am the Son of God.'" In the same way, the rebels who were crucified with him also heaped insults on him. From noon until 3 in the afternoon, darkness came over all the land. About 3 in the afternoon, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, "Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" When some of those standing there heard this, they said, "He's calling Elijah." Immediately one of them ran and got a sponge. He filled it with wine vinegar, put it on a staff, and offered it to Jesus to drink. The rest said, "Now leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes to save him." And when Jesus had cried out again in a loud voice, he gave up his spirit. At that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook, the rocks split, and the tombs broke open. The bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life. They came out of the tombs after Jesus' resurrection and went into the holy city and appeared to many people. When the centurion and those with him who were guarding Jesus saw the earthquake and all that had happened, they were terrified and exclaimed, "Surely he was the Son of God." Many women were there, watching from a distance. They had followed Jesus from Galilee to care for his needs. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Joseph, and the mother of Zebedee's sons. As evening approached, there came a rich man from Arimathea, named Joseph, who had himself become a disciple of Jesus. Going to Pilate, he asked for Jesus' body, and Pilate ordered that it be given to him. Joseph took the body, wrapped it in a clean linen cloth, and placed it in his own new tomb that he had cut out of the rock. He rolled a big stone in front of the entrance to the tomb and went away. Mary Magdalene and the other Mary were sitting there opposite the tomb. The next day, the one after the preparation day, the chief priests and the Pharisees went to Pilate. "Sir," they said, "we remember that while he was still alive, that deceiver said, 'After 3 days I will rise again.' So give the order for the tomb to be made secure until the 3rd day. Otherwise, his disciples may come and steal the body and tell the people that he has been raised from the dead. This last deception will be worse than the first." "Take a guard," Pilate answered. "Go, make the tomb as secure as you know how." So they went and made the tomb secure by putting a seal on the stone and posting the guard. That is Matthew 27. Let me pray for you all. Dear Lord, I ask that you help us to carry out your will in remembrance of you carrying out the will of the Father. I ask that you keep the hope of the resurrection in mind for all your believers whenever we face hardship, and remind us that you are not one who doesn't understand the hardship that we face, because you have faced something much, much harder than we could ever imagine. We love you, and we want to honor you in all that we do. It's in your name that I pray. Amen. Until next time, friends, you are sent.